Congratulations. You just woken up in the middle of a cold case that refuses to stay cold. And before we begin, I need you to do something. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan. Not because you're hot, but because white noise is somehow the perfect companion to a story about missing people and bureaucratic nightmares. Like someone invented it specifically for this moment. Here's a question for you. What did people do before fingerprint powder? They just looked at each other suspiciously, I guess. But here's the real question, the one that matters. How much of your life is documented in places you've never seen? Schools keep records. Hospitals keep records. The DMV keeps records. Attendance logs. Test scores. Addresses. Phone numbers. And most of the time, nobody reads them. They just sit there, filed away, gathering dust, waiting to expose a lie that's been hiding in plain sight. This is the story of a girl reported missing in 1991. Her name was Margaret Chun. She disappeared on a Tuesday in March, and it took a manila folder in a basement office to bring her back. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching from right now? Leave that in the comments. And if you like the sound of ordinary things turning sinister, like bureaucracy solving crimes, like manila folders and attendance sheets, and the terrible truth that sometimes the people we love are capable of unimaginable things, then maybe stick around. Maybe even hit that subscribe button, but only if you mean it. Now, let's talk about routines, because routines are where all the best lies hide. You're standing in the hallway of Lincoln High School on a Tuesday morning in 1991. The fluorescent lights buzz like insects. There's a smell, a mixture of floor wax, teenage desperation, and old paperback books. Students shuffle past. Lockers slam. A teacher's voice echoes from somewhere down the corridor. Normal. Utterly, completely normal. This is the world Margaret Chin knew. She was 16 years old, with shoulder-length black hair, and the kind of face that didn't stand out in a crowd. She wasn't the popular girl. She wasn't the outcast. She was somewhere in the middle, the demographic that makes up most of the hallway. Forgettable in the way that people at that age often are. Her parents, Claire and Robert Chen, had built a life that looked like every other life in their neighborhood. Robert was a contractor. He worked long hours. He came home tired. He loved his daughter, or at least, he said he did. Claire was a nurse. She worked doubles. She came home later. She worried about Margaret the way all mothers worry, with a specific anxiety that comes from not quite being sure what your teenager is doing when you're not there. Margaret had friends. Nothing serious. A few girls who sat with her at lunch. A boy she liked but never quite worked up the courage to talk to. She attended classes. She passed most of them. She got B's and C's, the kind of grades that didn't worry parents too much, but didn't make them proud either. She was ordinary. And here's the thing about ordinary lives. They're perfect cover for extraordinary lies. See, routines are the background music of existence. They're so constant, so expected, that nobody questions them. Margaret went to school. She came home. She did homework. She watched television. Her parents went to work. They came home. They asked about her day. She said it was fine. Everything fit. Everything made sense. Everyone knew their lines. But beneath that routine, something else was happening. Something nobody could see yet. The kind of thing that hides in the space between what people say and what's actually true. The space where most lies live. You ever notice how easy it is to say the word fine? How little it actually means. Margaret was fine. School was fine. Everything was fine. And because it was fine, nobody asked questions. Nobody looked too closely. Nobody wondered if the girl walking through those hallway doors every morning was actually the same girl walking through them at 3:15 in the afternoon. And that, as it turns out, was the biggest mistake everyone made. Let's talk about the neighbors. They've been watching you, not in a sinister way, just the way neighbors watch. They notice when your lights go on. They notice when your car is in the driveway. They notice routines. And on March 14th, 1991, Margaret Chen's routine broke. She didn't come home from school. Claire Chen was working a shift at Riverside Hospital. She didn't realize something was wrong until after 6 p.m. Margaret should have been home by 4:15. She should have called if she was going to be late. This was a rule. This had always been a rule. And Margaret, despite being 16, was generally not a rule breaker. So Claire called the school. The line went to the main office. A secretary answered. Claire asked if Margaret had been there that day. The secretary said yes. She'd been marked present in all her morning classes. Yes, she'd been in the cafeteria at lunch. Yes, everyone remembered seeing her. Everyone. That's the word that stuck with Claire as she hung up the phone. Everyone had seen her daughter, which meant Margaret had been fine that morning, which meant something had happened between 1:30 p.m. and 4:15 p.m. Something sudden, something that made a 16-year-old girl not come home. Claire called Robert at his job site. She could hear the sound of saws in the background, the scrape of materials. He said he'd come home. He said they should call the police. He sounded calm. He sounded like someone who had heard these words before and understood that they meant something had gone wrong. The police arrived at 7:45 p.m. Officer James Hendricks was the first on scene. He took notes. He asked questions. Did Margaret have a boyfriend? No. Did she have any friends who might have convinced her to stay out? Not that they knew of. Was there trouble at home? Both parents shook their heads. Everything was normal. They said everything was fine. But here's what the police don't know yet. Here's what nobody knows yet. The word fine is about to become the most dangerous word in this family's vocabulary because the police start making phone calls. They call Margaret's friends, the girls from lunch. They ask where Margaret was supposed to be after school. And the girls say something interesting. They say Margaret mentioned going to the mall. They say she seemed excited. They say she'd talk about catching a ride with someone from school. The police distribute the first description. Margaret Chen, age 16, approximately 5 feet 4 inches, last seen wearing a blue windbreaker and jeans. They put her photo in the newspaper. They start canvassing the neighborhood. They ask the neighbors. They've been watching, but they haven't seen anything. And somewhere in the chaos of the missing person report, in the panic and the phone calls and the questions about where a teenage girl could disappear in a town of 30,000 people, nobody is reading the attendance records. Dorothy Webb, the woman who keeps those records, is sitting in her basement office at Lincoln High School. She doesn't know that a girl is missing. She's just doing what she does every day. She's filing paperwork. She's entering attendance data. She's maintaining the system that tracks whether students showed up for school. And she's about to become the most important person in this case. 3 weeks pass. The search intensifies. Margaret Chen's face is on the news. Her mother gives an interview in the family living room, speaking carefully, as if words might break if she wasn't precise enough. Her father stands beside her, arm around her shoulders, looking at something just off camera. The police follow leads that go nowhere. A sighting at a bus station 2 hours away. A report of a girl matching Margaret's description at a shopping mall in the next county. None of it pans out. The case grows cold. The news cycle moves on. Margaret Chen becomes a kind of missing person that people forget about, the one whose photo you see on the back of a milk carton and then never think about again. But Detective Marcus Webb, who took over the case on day 4, isn't the type to forget. Marcus is the kind of cop who believes that cases solve themselves if you ask the right questions, not in a mystical way, in the practical sense. Every crime leaves a trail. Every person is sloppy. Every lie has a weak point. You just have to find it. On the 38th day of Margaret's disappearance, Marcus is sitting at his desk, reviewing files for the third time. He's read the missing person report so many times he could recite it from memory. He's interviewed the friends, the family, the neighbors, the teachers. Nobody has anything new to say. The case feels stuck. And then Marcus thinks about something that most detectives overlook. He thinks about attendance records. See, attendance records are boring. They're administrative. They're the kind of thing that police care about for exactly one reason: to establish a timeline. If Margaret was at school on the morning of March 14th, then she was alive and accounted for at 8 a.m. If she left school at the end of the day, then something happened between then and when she should have arrived home. So Marcus calls the school. He asks to speak with Dorothy Webb, the attendance coordinator. Dorothy is surprised by the call. She's an older woman, the type who's been doing the same job in the same school for so long that she's practically part of the building's infrastructure. She doesn't like surprises. Marcus asks a simple question. Could he see the attendance records from Margaretchen from February through June of 1991? Dorothy brings out the folders. They're meticulously organized. Each day is logged. Each class is accounted for. The records show exactly what everyone has been saying. Margaret attended school on March 14th. She was present in homeroom. She was present in English class. She was present in mathematics. She was present in biology. She was marked present for lunch period. And then, after March 14th, something shifts. Marcus notices it first because he's reading the records differently than the school has. He's not just looking at the fact that Margaret's name is there. He's looking at the handwriting. He's looking at the patterns. And he sees something that makes his stomach tighten. After March 14th, Margaret is still marked present every single day. All of March, all of April, all of May, all of June. She shows up to every class. She's present at lunch. She's accounted for. It's perfect. Too perfect. Attendance records aren't usually perfect. Kids miss school. They have flu. They have orthodontist appointments. They stay home for family reasons. But Margaret didn't miss a single day for 3 months. Marcus looks at Dorothy. He asks if that seems unusual. Dorothy nods slowly. She says she'd been thinking the same thing. She says that now that he mentions it, she can't quite remember entering all of those attendance records herself. She says her handwriting looks familiar, but different. She says maybe one of the other office workers helped out. But Marcus is already moving. He's already thinking 3 steps ahead, because he knows something that Dorothy doesn't know yet. He knows that Margaretchen has been missing for 38 days. And if she's been missing for 38 days, then someone has been forging her attendance records for 38 days. And that someone is probably not a school secretary working overtime. Here's something about motive that true crime documentaries don't always get right. They make it sound like people plan to do terrible things. Like they wake up one morning and think, today seems like a good day to commit a crime. Today seems like a good day to destroy my family. Today seems like a good day to lie to police and forgers and school officials. That's not how it works. What actually happens is slower, more insidious. What happens is that people face a problem they can't solve, a problem that grows, a problem that threatens everything they built, and they start lying about the small things. Tiny lies, lies that feel harmless, lies that are just ways of managing the problem until they figure out what to do. Claire and Robertson love their daughter. This is important. They did. But love is not the same as understanding. Love is not the same as knowing how to help. And sometimes love is actually what makes people do terrible things. Margaret had started to struggle in the fall of 1990. Nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts. She became quieter. She stopped hanging out with friends as much. She would sit in her room for hours. Her parents attributed it to teenage hormones. This is what parents do. They normalize adolescent unhappiness because the alternative, that something real is wrong, is too frightening to contemplate. But something real was wrong. Margaret was experiencing a mental health crisis. Depression, anxiety, thoughts that spiraled, a sense of disconnection that grew wider every day. By early 1991, she was struggling to get out of bed. She was struggling to go to school. She was struggling to pretend that she was fine. So Claire and Robert faced a choice. They could take her to a doctor. They could admit that their daughter was struggling. They could accept help, or they could handle it themselves. They could manage it quietly. They could wait for it to pass. They chose to handle it themselves. But handling it didn't work. The struggle got worse. Margaret became more withdrawn. And then in March 1991, something happened that broke the dam. We don't know exactly what. Maybe it was a panic attack. Maybe it was something she said. Maybe it was something she did. But something convinced Claire and Robert that Margaret needed to be somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't their house. Somewhere that wasn't school. Somewhere where she could be taken care of without anyone knowing about it. So they did something that made sense to them in that moment. They admitted Margaret to a psychiatric facility in a neighboring county. They used a different name. They told the staff a story about their daughter needing care, but needing privacy. And then they went back home and continued their lives as if nothing had happened. But they had a problem. Margaret had been marked present at school that day. If she didn't show up the next day, people would ask questions. Teachers would call home. The school counselor might get involved. The lie would unravel immediately. So they did the only thing they could think of. They forged attendance records. It started small, just a few days, just enough to explain why Margaret was missing from school. And then it became a routine. Every day, one of them would call the school or slip into the office during lunch period. Every day, they would mark Margaret present in classes she wasn't attending. Every day, the lie grew larger. This is how people rationalize terrible things. They tell themselves it's temporary. They tell themselves it's necessary. They tell themselves that as soon as the situation improves, they'll come clean. But the situation doesn't improve, and the lie keeps growing. And one day you're 3 months into forging your daughter's attendance records, and you can't remember how it started or how to stop it. Motive isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's just desperate. Detective Marcus Webb has been a cop for 19 years. He's learned something in those 19 years that you don't learn in the academy. People want to tell the truth, not because people are fundamentally honest, but because lies are exhausting. Lies require maintenance. They need to be fed. They need to be defended. Most people don't have the energy for it. So Marcus decides to apply pressure, not aggressive pressure, just enough pressure to see what breaks. He schedules a meeting with Robert and Claire Chun, not as suspects, not yet, just as the parents of a missing girl who had something to discuss regarding her attendance records. Claire brings a notebook. Robert brings his worry. They sit in a room that smells like stale coffee and old paper. The walls are a shade of beige that was probably trendy in 1976. Marcus doesn't accuse. He doesn't raise his voice. He just opens the attendance folder and sets it on the table between them. He asks a single question. Can you explain this? Claire and Robert stare at the folder. They stare at the records. They stare at the dates. And in that moment, they understand what has happened. They understand that the lie is over. They understand that the attendance records they forged have betrayed them in a way that no witness ever could. Robert speaks first. His voice is quiet. He says they were trying to help. He says Margaret needed help, and they were trying to help her. He says they didn't know what else to do. Claire starts crying. Real tears. The kind that come when you realize you've been holding your breath for months, and you can finally exhale. Marcus doesn't have to press further. The story comes out like something that's been building pressure for too long. They admit that Margaret had been struggling. They admit that they'd admitted her to Riverside Psychiatric Hospital under a different name. They admit that they'd been forging her attendance records to cover it up. They admit all of it. And then Marcus asks the question that changes everything. Where's Margaret now? That's when the second layer of the lie reveals itself. Because Margaret isn't in Riverside anymore. She was only there for 3 weeks. And the hospital, faced with insurance paperwork that didn't match the patient's identity, had transferred her to another facility. And then another. Margaret has been in the state's psychiatric system for the entire time she's been missing, shuffled from place to place, her records incomplete, her identity confused, living under a name that wasn't hers. She's been in the system the entire time, in plain sight, protected by the bureaucracy that was supposed to find her. It takes 3 days to locate her. She's in Highland State Hospital, 2 counties over, in a room that overlooks a courtyard. She's on medication. She's thinner. She's scared. She doesn't immediately recognize a detective who comes to talk to her. She doesn't immediately understand that she's been missing. She's been so deeply inside the psychiatric system that the outside world has stopped feeling real. But she's alive, and the manila folders, the attendance records, the bureaucratic system that everyone assumes is just administrative nonsense, those records brought her home. Not police work, not detective intuition, not witness testimony, a filing system, an inconsistency in paperwork. The simple fact that a teenage girl was marked present in classes while simultaneously being missing. Sometimes the most important lies are exposed by the most mundane truths. Margaret Chin spent 7 months in the state's psychiatric system before anyone found her. 7 months living under a different name. 7 months taking medication she didn't fully understand. 7 months being processed through a system that was designed to help her, but failed to ask the most basic question: who are you really? When Marcus finally brings her home, the house feels unfamiliar. Her room is exactly as she left it. Her posters are still on the walls. Her books are still on the shelf. But she's not the same girl who left that room. Trauma does something to you. It rewires you. It makes the world feel unstable even when everything is exactly where it should be. Claire and Robert don't know how to talk to their daughter. They don't know if they should apologize or explain or just pretend it didn't happen. So they do what they did before. They don't talk about it. They just exist in the same house, not quite connected, not quite separate. Margaret starts therapy, real therapy, with a real therapist who understands what it means to wake up in a hospital and be told you're someone else. She works through her depression. She works through her anxiety. She works through her anger at her parents. It takes years, but it works. Claire and Robert go through the legal system. They face charges. They face consequences. Their names appear in the newspaper. Their daughter's private struggle becomes public record. The community judges them. Some people understand. Some people don't. Most people just move on. Margaret Chen's case becomes old news, but it also becomes important news because the attention forces the school district to re-examine its attendance procedures. The attention forces the psychiatric hospital to improve its intake process. The attention forces the state to look at how it tracks patients who enter the system under false identities. Slowly, quietly, the systems that fail Margaret start to improve. Dorothy Webb, the attendance coordinator, never forged another record. She becomes hyper-vigilant about inconsistencies. She notices when attendance patterns don't match student life. She notices when something doesn't add up. In some ways, the case changes her more than it changes anyone else. She realizes that her job, which she'd always thought was administrative, is actually important. It's actually protective. Detective Marcus Webb solves a few more cases. He eventually retires. He moves to a quieter place. But he never quite forgets the case of the missing girl who was hiding inside the psychiatric system. He never quite forgets that sometimes the solution to a crime isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just someone reading the paperwork carefully enough to notice a lie. And Margaret, years later, with distance and time and medication and therapy between her and those months in the hospital, understands something that most missing people never quite grasp. She understands that being found isn't always a dramatic moment you see in movies. Sometimes being found is quiet. Sometimes it's boring. Sometimes it's just a detective noticing that a girl's attendance record doesn't match her absence. She's 34 years old now. She's alive. She's functional. She's better. She's still in therapy. She still takes medication. She still has complicated feelings about her parents. She still has complicated feelings about the hospital that house her under a false name. But she's here. She exists. She's not a missing person anymore. And somewhere in an archive in the basement of Lincoln High School, the attendance records are still filed away. They're kept as evidence. They're proof of what happens when people lie to the institutions that are supposed to protect us. They're proof that bureaucracy isn't glamorous or exciting, but sometimes it's the only thing standing between a missing person and staying lost forever. This is how some cases end. Not with handcuffs and confessions and dramatic courtroom scenes, but with files and folders and the slow realization that the systems we ignore are sometimes the systems that save us. You made it through the night. You've sat with a story about a girl who disappeared into bureaucracy and was found inside it. You've learned that motive isn't always malicious. You've learned that lives require maintenance. You've learned that attendance records matter, that filing systems matter, that the boring, invisible work of administration can be the difference between someone staying lost and being found. So here's my question for you. What did you think? Where are you watching from? Leave a comment. Engage. Tell me your thoughts. And if you want to hear more stories about how ordinary systems solve extraordinary crimes, subscribe. Not because I'm asking you to, but because you probably already want to. There's another case waiting, another lie waiting to be exposed, another set of records waiting to be read carefully enough to reveal the truth. Thanks for staying up late with me. Thanks for dimming the lights and turning on that fan, and pretending that a story about a missing girl and attendance records is somehow a perfect way to wind down before sleep. You've got a good taste in late-night content. Sleep well, and maybe, tomorrow, appreciate the system a little more, even the boring parts.